Hey everybody, welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java video. In this video, we're going to look at using objects. The objects that we're going to use are going to be text fields, labels, and buttons. I'm going to run the program that we're going to analyze, and then we can talk a little bit about it. The program is called Calculate. It's a really simple, kind of a stupid project. It's not really a calculator. It takes in two operands, and then it sums them and prints out the result on this label. So if I went 25 and 25, and then I calculate, it will output 50 to that label. Pretty simple program. I want to start really simple with this stuff. So let's look at these things. My class starts off with the usual class header. It is called Calculate. It is a JFrame, like always. It extends Action Listener because it's going to be interactive. You saw it's got that button that we interact with. I'm going to have two text fields, one called OP1 and one called OP2 for op1, op2, operand 1, operand 2. I've got three labels, plus, equals, and result. Plus is the label that shows the plus operator, equals is the label that shows the equals operator, and result will be the label that will show the outputted sum from our adding up operation, our summing operation. Then we've got a J button called Calculate that when we press it, it's going to sum those two operands and then output them to the result label. All right, take a look at the main. We do all the stuff we normally do in the main. We instantiate our object of the class Calculate into the main. We set our size, we create our GUI, and we set visible. Now I've kind of just glossed over these steps in the past, and I want to talk a little bit about them in depth now because I want to talk about that relationship between class and object and method and object. All right, so I've got a class that's called Calculate. You see, I'm defining that class right here. And that class has the ability to make as many instances of it as I want. And an instance is just essentially, while it's an object, it is a state of all of my variables holding some data somewhere in memory. And if I wanted to, I could make many objects of type Calculate. Okay? Well, I'm doing just that here. I'm creating an object of the type Calculate, and I'm calling it frame. So frame is the variable name of this reference type. So when I write a class, that class immediately becomes a type. Okay? Types are going to be, just like I said in a previous video, types are going to be primitive, or they could be reference types, primitives being your int, double, short, long, so on and so forth, and your reference types being things like JFrame, JPanel, JLabel, JTextField. All right, so this becomes a reference type that I create, and I can create variables of that type. Now, when we have reference types, we want to make objects of those types and store them in the variables. So this is what making an object looks like, and it's called instantiation. The reason we call it instantiation is because when we create a new object, we're actually creating a new instance of that class. And an instance is kind of like a snapshot or a point in time and space of the state of data for an object of a class. Okay, what I mean by that is it's going to talk about all the data that's held in all of the instance variables for that class. So these are all our instance variables. We've talked about instance variables in a previous unit. Instance variables are all those variables that anytime you create a new object, each one of those objects get their own set, their own copy of all those variables. So for every Calculate object that I create, it's going to get each and every one of these variables in its own location. So if I create 5 different Calculate objects, each of those Calculate objects would get its own op1, op2, plus, equals, result, and calculate. So they would get their own copies of the variables. And when they each get their own copies of the variables, they each get a value stored in all those variables. And that would be what we would call the object's state, or the state of that instance. Okay? So instantiation means we are creating a new instance of an object. So when I do this, new Calculate, it's invoking something called a constructor, and it's building the new state or the new instance for the object of this class. So it's building a new Calculate object. Now, when I have a Calculate object, I have the ability to call methods on that object. Now, given that calculate is a JFrame, I'm going to have access to all of those JFrame-like methods. So everything that a JFrame can do, this calculate object can do as well. So JFrames have the ability to set size and take in a dimension and set the size of that frame. This particular JFrame, calculate, has a method called create GUI. And if I have an object of type calculate, and I've got one called frame here, I can call that create GUI method to it. We call this method invocation. What's happening is this method is going to do its job on all of the data in this object. So let's take a look at that create GUI method and see how it relates to that object instantiation thing. We've been doing this all along, creating GUIs and stuff. The first thing that's going to happen is we'll set our default close operation. We're going to create a new container and call it window, and we're going to retrieve the content pane. So what this is going to do is it's going to get the, essentially, I described this thing kind of as a magnet board. Every JFrame has this blank invisible magnet board on which we can stick different GUI components. That's what the content pane is. It's a clear box or container that we can put things like text fields and stuff on. And then I'm going to set layout on my JFrame. All right? Now, in this method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create all of my GUI components and instantiate objects of all of those and add them to my calculate JFrame. So op1 is getting a new text field, op2 is getting a new text field. This is object instantiation. So once again, there is a class that somebody else wrote called JTextField. And what I'm doing now is I am invoking the one argument constructor from the JTextField class, thereby creating a new JTextField and storing it in this object reference variable. Okay, so when the new operator happens, it's going to set aside a memory location that'll store all of the data for this JTextField. I'm going to do the same thing for op2. JLabels all work exactly the same, so they've got the new operator setting aside memory locations that'll store all the data for each of these JLabels. So JLabel is one class, but you can see I'm creating 3 unique objects for each of those JLabels. When I run this, you'll see that those JLabels all have a different state. What I mean by that is this JLabel state has a plus for its render on the label. This one has the equals for the render on its label, and this one has the 0 for the render on its label. And I can even update the state of an instance. So if I do 23 plus 14 and then hit calculate, I'm updating this instance here. This is the result instance. Okay, so this JLabel has its own instance and it's stored in result, and I can update that instance at any time. It was initially 0, but then when I hit the calculate button, it updated it, and then our instance held a new value. Okay, so these are objects. Objects have the ability to be updated. So if we continue through here, we've got JButton created, we add all of our components, we know how that's done, we register our listener to the calculate button, and now it's a fully interactive JFrame. All right, let's really quickly look at action performed so you can see how this actually works. This should not be anything new, but what I'm doing here is I'm creating 2 new variables that are type int called op1 and op2, and what I want to do is I want to get the text from the op1 instance of the JTextField. So I've got 2 different JTextFields, op1 and op2. Each one of them is from the JTextField class, but each one is a unique instance. In other words, both of those instances, they come from the JTextField class. They both hold their own data set, so they both display in their own unique manner. I've got op1 text field here. If I put 12 into it, that instance will get updated to hold 12. And then I'm going to have this one, this is going to have 45. And when I hit calculate, what's going to happen is it's going to get the text from op1, and it's going to parse it into an int and store it in this variable. Then it's going to get the text from op2, it's going to parse it into an int and store it in this int variable. All right, so each of those instances of the JText field got their own data in it, and we could retrieve that data from those instances. So what you're seeing here is that classes have the ability to store data and perform functions. And when they store data, oftentimes we can retrieve that data and we can update that data. That's called getting and setting instance variables. And then right here, I'm just using those values in OP1 and OP2. Now, in a previous unit, we talked about the difference between local variables and instance variables. These two variables are created inside the action performed, so they're local. Even though they have the same names as our instance variables OP1 and OP2, these are JText fields. They're created at instance level. What that means is they're not inside of any methods. They're not created inside of the main. They're not created inside of action performed. They're not created inside of create GUI. They're all created outside at class level. When they're created at class level, that means that everything has access to them and that they are tied to an instance. And every instance of the calculate object would have their own copies of these. Not to be confused with local variables. These ones have the same name as those instance variables, but they're created locally to this method. In other words, they don't exist outside of this method. They don't exist inside of main. They don't exist inside of create GUI. They don't exist at class level. They only exist every time that action performed is invoked. So when I press a button and action performed gets invoked, these two new variables pop into existence. They get used to make a sum, and then we terminate the method, and those variables get destroyed. In other words, they're deleted from existence. So those are local variables versus instance variables. All right, so in review, what you've seen here is how we can use objects from predefined classes that other people wrote at other times, JTextField, JLabel, JButton, and each one of those JLabels and each one of those JFields had their own copies of all their own data. All right, so this is that object-class relationship. In the next couple of videos, what I'm going to do is just show you some new types of GUI components. I'm going to show you how you can make instance variables and use them along with different GUI components. Thanks for watching.